The winter of 1942 was Britain's darkest hour. Not from bombs falling on London, not from tanks rolling across Europe, but from something far more insidious. Beneath the cold gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, silent predators were strangling the life from the British Isles. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Every week, thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition disappeared beneath the waves. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who had stood defiant through the Blitz, would later write that, of all the threats Britain faced during the war, only one truly terrified him: the U-boat peril. By early 1942, the situation had become desperate. In January alone, German submarines sent over 300,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean. The Americans had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor, but their east coast was virtually undefended. German U-boat commanders called it the Second Happy Time, as they picked off merchant ships sailing along American shores like fish in a barrel. The lights of cities from New York to Miami silhouetted their targets perfectly against the night sky. It was a turkey shoot. But the real battle, the one that would decide the fate of the war, was being fought in the mid-Atlantic, in that vast stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. Here, convoys of merchant ships laden with the materials of war had to run a gauntlet of German submarines. The U-boats had developed a terrifying new tactic. They operated in groups in what became known as wolf packs. A single U-boat would spot a convoy, shadow it from a distance, and radio its position. Then, like sharks drawn to blood, other submarines would converge from all directions. The attacks came at night. U-boats would surface under cover of darkness, slip between the columns of merchant ships, and fire their torpedoes from point-blank range. By the time the escorts realized what was happening, the submarines had already dived and vanished into the black depths. Ships exploded, broke apart, and sank within minutes. Men found themselves in the freezing water, calling out in the darkness. The escort ships would race to where they thought the U-boat might be, dropping depth charges randomly, hoping for the best. But more often than not, the submarine escaped, and another merchant ship went down. The Royal Navy's escort commanders were brave, experienced men, but they were fighting blind. They knew the U-boats were using new tactics, but they didn't understand exactly what those tactics were, or how to counter them. After each convoy battle, reports would come in detailing what had happened, but no one seemed able to piece together the bigger picture. Ships kept sinking, U-boats kept escaping, and Britain kept inching closer to starvation. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of one of World War II's most remarkable untold victories, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories from history. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think about what these young women accomplished. In Liverpool, at a building called Derby House behind the city's town hall, a different kind of battle was being planned. This was the headquarters of Western Approaches Command, the nerve center for the war in the Atlantic. Here, in a massive operations room, officers tracked every convoy, every escort, every known U-boat position. The walls were covered with maps, tables were piled with reports, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Admiral Sir Percy Noble commanded Western Approaches. He was a capable officer, but even he was running out of ideas. The U-boats were winning, and everyone knew it. In desperation, the Admiralty decided to try something unconventional. They would establish a special unit dedicated to studying the U-boat problem through wargaming. The idea was to recreate the battles on paper, or rather on the floor, and work out what the Germans were actually doing and how to stop them. On the first day of January 1942, a man named Gilbert Roberts arrived at Derby House for his first meeting with Admiral Noble. Roberts was 41 years old, a retired naval officer who had been forced to leave active service 4 years earlier after contracting tuberculosis. He had spent the years before the war teaching tactics at the Royal Navy's school in Portsmouth, where he had become known for his innovative use of war games. He had an almost obsessive interest in the subject, constantly refining his rules and methods. The meeting did not go well. Noble looked at this civilian, this retired officer who could no longer serve at sea, and made no secret of his disappointment. "The Admiralty were sending me a captain," he said coldly. Instead, they had sent Roberts. Nevertheless, Noble had his orders. He told Roberts that the entire top floor of Derby House had been set aside for his use. 8 rooms. There, Roberts was to establish the Western Approach's tactical unit and figure out how to beat the U-boats. Roberts knew exactly what he needed to do, but he had one major problem. He needed a team, but there were no men available. Every able-bodied naval officer was needed at sea, so Roberts made an unconventional decision. He would recruit from the Women's Royal Naval Service, known affectionately as the Wrens. These were young women who had volunteered to serve their country in whatever capacity they could. Most were assigned to clerical work, plotting positions in the operations room or working as radio operators. But Roberts had something different in mind. He began interviewing candidates. He wasn't looking for typists or clerks. He wanted women with sharp analytical minds, women who could think strategically, women who understood mathematics and logic. He found them. Elizabeth Drake was already working at Derby House as a plotter. Laura Jane Howes, known as Bobby, was a mathematical prodigy from Antigua. Nancy Wales had been a passionate hockey player and was selected specifically because Roberts believed her understanding of team tactics would translate to naval warfare. Jean Laidlaw was a Scottish chartered accountant, one of the first women in Britain to achieve that qualification. And then there was Janet O'Kell. She was only 17 years old when she walked into Roberts's makeshift office in January 1942. She had been trained as a plotter, learning to track ship movements on the big map boards in the operations room. But Roberts saw something in her, some spark of tactical instinct. He assigned her to the Western Approach's tactical unit. She would stay there for the entire war. In total, 66 Wrens would serve at Watteau between 1942 and 1945. Most were between 17 and 21 years old. These were not hardened military officers. These were girls, really, young women barely out of school. Some had never been away from home before joining the service, and yet Roberts believed they could do something that had eluded the best minds in the Royal Navy. They could figure out how to beat the U-boats. The Watteau facility was primitive. The largest room on the top floor of Derby House became their wargaming space. Roberts had it divided into a grid representing the ocean. He acquired basic ship models and taught his team the rules he had developed over years of study. But the real innovation was the chalk. Using different colored chalks, the team would draw on the floor the tracks of ships, the positions of U-boats, the patterns of movement during an attack. The U-boat tracks were drawn in brown chalk so they would be visible to the umpires but could be partially concealed from the players. Roberts set up a screen at one end of the room. When officers came to play the war games, they would stand behind this screen just as they would be confined to the bridge of their ship at sea. They could only see what their ship's lookouts could see. They couldn't see the chalk lines on the floor showing where the U-boats actually were. Just like in real life, they were fighting blind. The Wrens took to the work with extraordinary enthusiasm. Roberts trained them in anti-submarine warfare, in the capabilities of sonar equipment, in the range and speed of torpedoes, in the diving and surfacing characteristics of U-boats. They absorbed everything. Within weeks, they were ready to begin their first war games. Roberts started by recreating recent convoy battles from the actual after-action reports. The goal was simple: understand what had really happened. One of their first tasks was to restage a battle from December 1941 in which British escorts had successfully hunted 3 U-boats. They set up the scenario exactly as it had occurred. Wrens played the roles of the escort commanders. Other Wrens played the U-boat captains. As the game unfolded, something remarkable happened. The tactics that the real escort commanders had used didn't work in the war game. More importantly, when the Watu team tried to recreate what they thought the U-boats had been doing, based on the standard German tactics everyone assumed they were using, the results didn't match what had actually happened in the battle. The pieces didn't fit. So the Wrens tried something different. What if, they suggested, the U-boats weren't attacking from outside the convoy as everyone assumed? What if they were doing something more audacious? The team repositioned their model U-boats. They had them wait along the convoy's expected path, let the convoy pass over them, then surface behind the last ships and attack from within the convoy's columns. They ran the scenario again. This time, everything clicked into place. The results matched the actual battle perfectly. The Watu team had cracked the code. The U-boats weren't attacking from outside. They were infiltrating the convoys, hiding among the merchant ships like wolves in sheep's clothing, and striking from within. Armed with this understanding, Roberts and his team began developing countermeasures. If the U-boats were attacking from within the convoy, then the escorts needed to change their response entirely. The standard procedure when a ship was torpedoed was for escorts to rush to the stricken vessel. But that was exactly the wrong thing to do. It left gaps in the screen through which other U-boats could slip. Instead, the Watu team developed a new tactic. When a torpedo struck, instead of converging on the damaged ship, the escorts would move in a coordinated triangular sweeping pattern, systematically hunting through the area where the U-boat must be. The pattern was designed to flush out the submarine, force it to show itself on sonar, and keep it from escaping. Jean Laidlaw, the Scottish accountant, named this new tactic the raspberry. When asked why, she said with a mischievous grin that it was what she wanted to give to Hitler. It was a cheeky name for a deadly serious tactic, but it stuck. Admiral Noble remained skeptical. He made no secret of his doubts. How could these young women, armed with nothing more than chalk and string and little model ships, possibly contribute anything to the battles being waged at sea? But he agreed to watch a demonstration. The next day, Noble arrived at the Watu facility with his staff. The atmosphere was tense. Roberts knew this was their one chance to prove their worth. The Wrens set up the game, recreating an attack on a recent convoy. Noble watched from behind the screen, seeing only what an escort commander would see. The game began. A convoy of merchant ships moved across the floor. Then a Wren playing a U-boat infiltrated the columns and fired a torpedo. A merchant ship was hit. In the game, escorts began to respond. Roberts called out the new tactic, the raspberry. The escort models moved in their triangular sweeping pattern, methodically covering the area. Noble leaned forward in his chair. One of the escorts picked up the U-boat on its sonar. The pattern continued. The U-boat tried to escape but kept running into the searching escorts. There was no way out. As Noble watched, he began to see for the first time the fundamental errors that had been costing so many lives. The old tactics had been reactive, chaotic. The new tactics were proactive, systematic. When the demonstration finished, Noble stood up. He congratulated Roberts on the spot and asked what the maneuver should be officially called. From that moment, everything changed for Watu. Noble ordered that all escort commanders must attend the Watu course. The raspberry tactic was immediately sent out to the fleet, and Roberts received a promotion. Notably, the Wrens received no official recognition, but that was hardly surprising for the time. What mattered was that their tactics worked. The Watu team set up a training course. It ran for a week, and it was intensive. Officers would come to Liverpool, climb the stairs to the top floor of Derby House, and find themselves being instructed by women half their age. Not all of them were pleased about this arrangement initially. These were career naval officers, men who had spent decades at sea, and here they were being taught tactics by teenagers. But the Wrens had a gift. They knew their stuff cold, but more importantly, they knew how to teach without wounding male pride. They would guide the officers through complex maneuvers, gently pointing out mistakes, suggesting alternatives, always making the officers feel that they were discovering the solutions themselves. It was a delicate balance, and the Wrens managed it beautifully. Over the course of the war, more than 5,000 Allied naval officers would attend the Watteau course. Every single one of them, without exception, came away impressed. The young women weren't just playing games. They were teaching life-saving tactics based on rigorous analysis of real battles. As the Raspberry began to be used at sea, the Watteau team continued their work. The Germans adapted their tactics, and Watteau stayed ahead of them. When U-boats started attacking differently, the Wrens developed new countermeasures. They created tactics with code names like Strawberry, Gooseberry, and Pineapple, each designed to counter specific German maneuvers. One particularly challenging problem emerged in September 1943. The Germans had developed a new weapon, an acoustic homing torpedo called the T-5, which the British referred to as the Gnat. This torpedo didn't need to be aimed precisely. It had hydrophones built in, and it would follow the sound of a ship's propellers. Escorts found themselves being hit from behind as they bore down on U-boats. The torpedo would literally chase them. The Watteau team went to work. They analyzed how the torpedo worked, its range, its turning capability, its speed. Then they developed a new tactic called step aside. When an escort approached a U-boat that might have acoustic torpedoes, it would make sharp, sudden turns, zigzagging its approach. The torpedo couldn't follow these rapid changes in direction. It would lose the signal and miss. Step aside saved countless ships and lives. Janet Okel, that 17-year-old girl who had joined Watteau in its earliest days, had proven to be a natural. She had an instinctive grasp of submarine tactics that amazed everyone. In November 1942, Admiral Max Horton had replaced Noble as commander of Western approaches. Horton was a submarine warfare expert himself, a legendary figure who had commanded submarines in World War I. Roberts asked Horton to test a new tactic they had developed called beta search. Horton agreed to play the war game himself, commanding the U-boat. On the other side, playing as the escorts, were Janet Okel and Jean Laidlaw. These two young women, a teenage rating and a chartered accountant, went up against one of the Royal Navy's most experienced submarine commanders. They sank his U-boat 5 times in a row. Horton was astonished. He kept demanding to see the chalk tracks on the floor, checking what the escorts could actually see through the viewing screen. After the 3rd time they got him, he was almost incredulous. When he discovered that his opponent had been a 19-year-old Wren, he said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly in respect. The tactics worked. More importantly, beta search was immediately adopted by the fleet. The work of Watteau was not done in isolation. The wider war was turning in the Allies' favor through a combination of factors. The code breakers at Bletchley Park were reading German naval signals, allowing convoys to be routed away from known U-boat positions when possible. New technology was being deployed. Radar sets were getting better, able to detect surfaced submarines at greater distances. Long-range aircraft, particularly the American B-24 Liberator bombers, were closing the mid-Atlantic air gap where convoys had previously been beyond air cover. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ships, were beginning to sail with the convoys, providing constant air coverage. The Hedgehog, a new type of forward-throwing depth charge that only exploded on contact with the submarine, was being installed on escorts. All of these factors combined to make life increasingly dangerous for U-boat crews. But tactics remained crucial. You could have all the technology in the world, but if your ships didn't know how to use it effectively, if they didn't coordinate properly, if they reacted instead of anticipated, you would still lose ships. That's where Watteau made its difference. The tactics developed on the chalk-marked floor in Liverpool were being used every day in the Atlantic, saving ships and taking down U-boats. The crisis point came in the spring of 1943. In March, the U-boat offensive reached its peak. German submarines sank 120 ships worldwide that month, including 82 ships in the Atlantic alone, representing 476,000 tons of shipping. The Germans lost only 12 U-boats. It was the closest they ever came to winning the tonnage war. A British Admiralty report concluded that the Germans had never come so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. The supply situation in Britain had become critical. There was talk of not being able to continue the war. Fuel supplies were particularly low. Some officials even discussed abandoning the convoy system entirely. It seemed like nothing was working, but April brought a slight improvement. 39 ships were lost in the Atlantic, but 15 U-boats were destroyed. The ratio was beginning to shift. Still, losses were heavy. In late April, a single U-boat, the U-515, attacked convoy TS-37 and sank 7 tankers, 4 of them in just 3 minutes. It was the kind of devastating attack that showed the U-boats were still very much a threat. Then came May 1943. This would become known in German naval circles as Black May, and it marked the decisive turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The month opened with the battle for convoy ONS-5. This convoy consisted of 43 merchant ships sailing from Liverpool to Nova Scotia. It was escorted by 16 warships, a strong escort by any measure. But Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the German U-boat force, saw an opportunity. He directed 30 submarines, an entire wolf pack, to converge on the convoy. It would be the biggest convoy battle yet. The battle lasted over a week as the convoy made its slow way across the Atlantic. The U-boats attacked repeatedly, trying to break through the escort screen. But something was different this time. The escorts were using Watteau tactics. They didn't panic when torpedoes struck. They didn't rush randomly to drop depth charges. They moved in coordinated patterns, hunting methodically, anticipating where the U-boats would be rather than just reacting to where they had been. When the battle ended, 13 merchant ships had been sent to the bottom. It was a heavy loss, but the Germans had lost 6 U-boats. That exchange ratio was unprecedented. For the first time, the escorts were inflicting unacceptable losses on the Wolfpack. 2 weeks later came convoy SC-130. Once again, a U-boat pack attacked. This time, the result was even more dramatic. Not a single merchant ship was lost, but 3 U-boats were destroyed, and a 4th was damaged. Admiral Donitz's son Peter was serving aboard one of those submarines, the U-954. He did not survive. Throughout May 1943, the pattern repeated across the Atlantic. Convoys were attacked, but the escorts fought back with unprecedented effectiveness. The Watteau tactics, combined with improved technology and air cover, were taking a devastating toll on the U-boat force. The statistics for May were shocking. The Allies lost 58 merchant ships, totaling about 300,000 tons. That was bad enough, but compare it to March's losses of over 600,000 tons. The trend was clear. Allied losses were declining. But the real story was on the German side. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were destroyed. Some sources put the number as high as 43. Either way, it represented 25% of the entire operational U-boat force. In a single month, a quarter of Germany's submarines had been eliminated. To put this in perspective, in March, 12 U-boats had been lost. In April, 15. In May, over 40. The rate at which U-boats were being destroyed had more than tripled. The chalk tricks developed by those young women in Liverpool were working exactly as designed. 18 of those U-boats were lost in direct convoy battles in the Atlantic. 14 were destroyed by air patrols, many of them in the Bay of Biscay as they tried to enter or leave their bases in occupied France. The rest were lost to various other causes, but the cumulative effect was devastating to German morale and capability. Admiral Dönitz was shocked. These were losses he could not sustain. German shipyards were producing about 20 U-boats per month. In May, they lost more than twice that number. The trained crews lost represented an even greater blow. These weren't just submarines going to the bottom. These were experienced commanders, skilled officers, and trained men who took years to replace. On the 24th of May, 1943, Dönitz made a fateful decision. He ordered a temporary withdrawal from the Atlantic. The U-boats were pulled back to regroup and recover. He later wrote in his memoirs, quite simply, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." The U-boats would return in autumn, equipped with new defensive anti-aircraft weapons and different tactics. But they never regained the advantage. The ratio continued to favor the Allies for the rest of the war. The combination of technology, intelligence, air power, and tactics proved insurmountable. And at the heart of those tactics were the methods developed at Hua-Tuo. The simple chalk drawings on a linoleum floor had translated into coordinated patterns of ship movements at sea. The war games played by young women barely out of their teens had prepared thousands of officers for real combat. The seemingly stupid idea of using children's games to fight a modern war had worked beyond anyone's expectations. The impact of Hua-Tuo extended beyond the immediate tactical innovations. The unit represented a radical shift in how the military approached problem-solving. Before Hua-Tuo, tactics were largely the domain of experienced sea officers who drew on their years of service. Analysis was qualitative, based on instinct and tradition. Hua-Tuo introduced a methodical, scientific approach. They tested ideas, they measured results, they refined their methods based on evidence. Moreover, Hua-Tuo demonstrated the value of diverse perspectives. These young women, precisely because they weren't career naval officers, weren't bound by conventional thinking. They could imagine new approaches without being constrained by how things had always been done. Their mathematical training gave them the analytical tools to break down complex problems. Their youth gave them the energy and enthusiasm to work tirelessly on solutions. After D-Day in June 1944, Hua-Tuo continued to develop tactics for the invasion of Europe and later for the Pacific War. The lessons learned in the Atlantic were applied to new challenges. By the time Hua-Tuo formally closed at the end of July 1945, it had trained thousands of officers and developed dozens of tactical innovations that had saved countless lives. But the contribution of the Hua-Tuo Wrens remained largely unknown for decades after the war. Their work was classified, and in the post-war years, their role was overshadowed by more dramatic stories. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park eventually received recognition. The scientists who developed radar became celebrated. The pilots and sailors who fought the battles became heroes. But the young women who had figured out how to win those battles remained in the shadows. It wasn't until the 21st century that historians began to fully appreciate what had been accomplished in that top-floor room in Derby House. In 2022, a television documentary called U-Boat Wargamers brought their story to a wider audience. The Western Approaches Museum in Liverpool now has a permanent exhibition dedicated to Hua-Tuo and the Wrens who served there. What makes this story so remarkable is not just that these young women succeeded, but that they succeeded in an environment that was fundamentally not designed for them. The military in 1942 was an overwhelmingly male institution. Women were allowed to serve, but in limited supporting roles. The idea that teenage girls could teach experienced naval commanders how to fight submarines must have seemed absurd to many. But Gilbert Roberts saw past those prejudices. He recognized talent and intelligence regardless of age or gender. And the Wrens themselves proved day after day, game after game, that they belonged at that table. They earned the respect of every officer who passed through their course, not through rhetoric or demands, but through competence and results. Janet Okell continued serving at Watteau throughout the entire war. June Duncan, another of the original Wrens, went on to become one of Britain's top fashion models in the 1950s. Jean Laidlaw, who had named the Raspberry tactic, married Peter Gretton, one of the escort commanders who had taken the Watteau course, and used those tactics to successfully defend convoy ONS-5. They had met during one of the training sessions, a romance born from shared understanding of the deadly chess game being played in the Atlantic. The chalk marks on the floor of Derby House are long gone. The building itself is now a museum. The Wrens who served at Watteau are mostly gone too, having lived out their lives in the post-war years, carrying with them memories of those intense days when they were at the center of the most important naval battle in history. But their legacy remains. Every time military forces use wargaming to develop tactics, they're following in the footsteps of Watteau. Every time diverse teams are brought together to solve complex problems, there's an echo of that room in Liverpool. Every time someone questions whether young people or women can contribute to traditionally male-dominated fields, the story of the Watteau Wrens provides a definitive answer. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by many factors. The courage of merchant seamen who kept sailing despite terrible losses. The bravery of escort crews who hunted submarines in all weather conditions. The brilliance of code breakers who read German signals. The innovation of scientists who developed new technologies. The industrial might of American shipyards that replaced losses faster than they occurred. But among all these factors, there's a special place for those young women who, armed with nothing more than chalk, string, and determination, figured out how to make German U-boats sink 3 times faster than before. They took a problem that had baffled admirals and solved it through methodical analysis and creative thinking. They transformed abstract games into concrete results at sea. In May 1943, when those 41 U-boats went to the bottom, each one represented the validation of a tactical principle developed at Watteau. Each submarine destroyed was a testament to the effectiveness of the methods these young women had pioneered. The Raspberry, the Strawberry, Beta Search, Step Aside. These weren't just cute code names. They were proven techniques that gave Allied escorts a fighting chance against an enemy that had seemed unbeatable. Admiral Horton, that gruff submarine warfare expert who had been sunk 5 times in a row by Janet Okell and Jean Laidlaw, later said that the battle fought on the linoleum floor at Watteau was as important as any battle fought at sea. Many of the officers who took the course said the same thing. They arrived skeptical and left believers. The games had seemed abstract at first, but when they got out into the Atlantic and found themselves in an actual convoy battle, they discovered that the situations they faced were exactly what they had practiced in Liverpool. The tactics that had worked on the chalk-marked floor worked in the real ocean. Ships and lives were saved because of what they had learned from those young women. The story of the Watteau Wrens reminds us that the greatest innovations often come from unexpected places. That youth and inexperience can sometimes be advantages rather than liabilities. That diversity of thought and background can solve problems that homogeneous groups cannot. That simple tools, properly applied with intelligence and determination, can achieve more than complex systems used without understanding. It also reminds us that history is full of unsung heroes. For every famous name, there are dozens of people who contributed just as much, but remained in the shadows. The Watteau Wrens didn't seek glory. Most of them never even told their families what they had done during the war, bound by the Official Secrets Act even decades later. They had been given a job to do, and they did it with skill and dedication. But perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates that in times of crisis, we need to be willing to try unconventional solutions. In early 1942, the situation in the Atlantic was desperate. Every conventional approach had failed. The U-boats were winning. Britain was being strangled. In that moment, the Admiralty was willing to try something that must have seemed ridiculous to many, turning over a critical tactical problem to a retired officer suffering from tuberculosis and a group of teenage girls. That willingness to think outside the box, to give unconventional people a chance, to judge results rather than appearances, that made all the difference. If Admiral Noble had refused to give Roberts and his Wrens a chance, if he had insisted on waiting for experienced male officers to become available, how much longer would the Battle of the Atlantic have continued? How many more ships would have been lost? How many more men would have perished in the cold waters? We can't know for certain, but the statistics suggest the answer. In March 1943, before Watteau's tactics were widely implemented, 12 U-boats were lost. By May, after thousands of officers had been trained in those tactics, 41 U-boats were destroyed. The rate had more than tripled. The tide had turned. So the next time you hear someone say that a problem is too complex for young people to tackle, or that certain fields should remain the exclusive domain of those who have always dominated them, remember the Watteau Wrens. Remember those 17 and 18 and 19-year-old women armed with chalk and determination who solved a problem that had defeated admirals. Remember that they didn't just solve it. They revolutionized anti-submarine warfare and trained 5,000 officers in methods that proved decisively effective. Remember Janet Aukel, who joined at 17 and stayed for the entire war, developing such an instinctive grasp of submarine tactics that she repeatedly bested one of Britain's most legendary submarine commanders. Remember Jean Laidlaw, who gave the world the raspberry because she wanted to give something to Hitler. Remember Laura Jane Howes, the mathematical prodigy from Antigua, who helped translate complex tactical problems into solvable equations. Remember all 66 women who served at Watteau, each contributing to victory in their own way. Their chalk marks faded long ago, washed away when the war ended and Derby House returned to peacetime purposes. But the impact of what they drew on that floor echoes through the decades. Every naval officer who studies anti-submarine warfare today learns principles that were first developed in that room. Every military force that uses wargaming as an analytical tool is following their example. Every time someone succeeds in a field where they're not expected to belong, they're walking a path those women helped to clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, lasting from the war's first day to its last. It involved thousands of ships, tens of thousands of people, and spanned millions of square miles of ocean. The outcome was never certain until the very end. But when it was finally won, when the U-boats were defeated and the supply lines secured, one of the crucial factors in that victory was the work done by young women drawing on a floor with chalk. They proved that genius comes in many forms, that solutions emerge from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not ships or bombs or torpedoes, but ideas, good ideas, tested ideas, ideas that work. The simple chalk trick that made German U-boats sink 3 times faster wasn't magic. It was intelligence, creativity, hard work, and courage applied to a seemingly insurmountable problem. And it worked. Against all odds and all expectations, it worked. If you found this story fascinating, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story from World War II. Leave a comment telling me what other untold stories you'd like to hear about. And share this video with anyone who loves history, because stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for watching.